have officially finished up in the Old Testament, but before we move on into the New Testament, I want us to take some time to look at the events that happened in between the two. We don't have scriptures that were written during this time because it's the gap between testaments, and a lot of people would say that this was a period of time in which God was silent, but I'm going to argue otherwise. He wasn't silent, he just spoke differently than most people were used to. As a matter of fact, we have an entire book of the Bible that was written about the events of this 400-year period, the book of Daniel. Daniel was not written during these years, but he prophesied about them. If our study was a more textual study, that's where we'd be spending our time today. As it is, the things that we're going to talk about today are not recorded in Scripture, but their results are evidenced in Scripture, and I'm going to show you what I mean. All throughout the New Testament, we see references to synagogues. However, synagogues were not always a part of the Jewish life. There's a lot of debate as to the establishment of synagogues, but most scholars believe that probably the Jews started this tradition when they were in Babylonian captivity because they could no longer worship at the temple. Some scriptures that we often see as the beginnings of synagogues are found in the book of Ezra, where we see that the law was brought and read from a wooden pulpit, that they gave sense so that the people understood the reading, and that as Ezra blessed the Lord, the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Whenever it happened, ever since they began, synagogues are seen wherever the Jews lived. The Jews continued to go to the temple for appointed feasts and sacrificial worship, but they often participated in local synagogue worship as well. To establish a synagogue, there had to be a minimum of 10 Jewish men, and the location had to be central enough for Jews to attend without breaking the Sabbath by walking further than the rabbis allowed. The synagogues they were created as a means of preserving the Jewish faith and worship. This worship consisted of readings from Scripture, which would have been the Old Testament at the time, prayers, songs, and sometimes a sermon, but never sacrifices. Sacrifices were reserved for temple worship only. We often see Jesus teaching in the synagogues and also facing opposition. The Apostle Paul always went to synagogues first when he went on his missionary journeys. The exception to that is Philippi, where it is believed that there were not enough Jews to have a synagogue, so he went to a place where the faithful Jews met, as seen in Acts chapter 16, verse 13, which reads, "And on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together." More often than not, Paul was forced to leave the synagogues. As persecution advanced, the believers were forced out of some of the synagogues, and the church and the synagogue were finally separated permanently in the first part of the 2nd century. Another significant change that took place during the Inter-Testamental period is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Why was this necessary? Well, it was necessary because Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language as early as the time of the exile or the return of the Jews from that exile. Aramaic then became the common language of the Jewish people. With the rise of Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire, the Jews were scattered and then Hellenized, and at this point, Greek became the primary language. Therefore, it was necessary for the Scriptures to be translated into Greek. This is cool information to have, sure, but what does it have to do with us? I was hoping you'd ask that question. The Septuagint is an invaluable resource for us as Christians. In some ways, the influence is quite obvious. For example, the title for Jesus in the New Testament, Christ or Christos, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, which is anointed one, in the Septuagint. Side note, please don't put any weight in these pronunciations whatsoever. They're all uneducated guesses at best. Other words, such as glory, which is doxa, Lord, kurios, and gospel, euangelion, all get their special meanings from the Septuagint. Another reason the Septuagint is vital for us is the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament. The reason for that is that most of the direct citations of the Old Testament that we find in the New Testament match the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew Bible. There are approximately 300 Old Testament passages that are directly quoted or strongly alluded to in the New Testament. In most of the cases, the New Testament writers did not cite the Old Testament text word for word, but they paraphrased the Old Testament text using Jewish exegetical techniques. However, in the cases where the Old Testament is cited word for word, roughly 70% of the time the New Testament writers quote the Septuagint over the Hebrew text. Some scholars would say that that percentage goes up to 90, but there are disagreements on what counts as a citation, of course. We can't take it as a blanket statement, but a lot of the time, the majority of the Septuagint citations in the New Testament and the key theological terms demand that we take the Septuagint seriously. It's important to note that there are differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible in every book of the Old Testament. Most of the differences are quite small, but some do involve entire paragraphs. There are differences in the genealogies in Genesis, there are differences in the Psalms, Esther, Daniel, Joshua, Samuel, Numbers, Kings, and more. The importance of the Septuagint is undeniable. It sheds much needed light on the important words and the theological concepts in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. It also helps us to understand the religious and the political context in which Jesus lived, which will be very beneficial as we go on through the rest of the study. The Septuagint has helped scholars determine which translations are the most reliable, and it also gives us better insight into the church fathers and the early Christian church. I really hope this lesson gave you guys some insight as to what things went on during the 400 years that people say God was silent, because he definitely wasn't, and it's so important for us to know that.